So today we'll be talking about the Olympic Games in general, where it came from, what it evolved into. First, I will talk about the origins, or as some politicians like to say, about the oranges of the Olympic Games. So the Olympic Games originated in ancient Greece, as many of you probably know. The first Olympic Games were held at Olympia on the eastern coast of the Peloponnesian peninsula, and this was around 776 BC. So this is the earliest record from my understanding, but it's possible that the Games started even before that. So this was during the pre-Christian era, and at the time the Olympic Games would take place every 4 years. This was the Greeks' way to honor their gods. Now, structurally, the ancient Olympic Games were very different from what we're used to see nowadays. In particular, they included competition in music, oratory, and theater performances. And interestingly, all wars would cease during the Olympic Games, which is very different from what we see in modern times, where we know that the Olympics were interrupted twice because of the two world wars. So the earliest records show that only one athletic event was held. This was a foot race of about 183 meters, which is approximately the length of the stadium. Now, the first few Olympics were very local. They were limited to one race on one day. Then the second race was added. It was twice the length of the stadium, and that happened on the 14th time. And then a still longer race was added to the next competition 4 years later. At some point, the powerful Spartans started to take part in the competitions, and they influenced what the Olympic Games looked like. The 18th Olympic Games included wrestling and pentathlon that consisted of running, jumping, spear throwing, discus throwing, and wrestling. And then boxing was added, and then the games continued to expand. And then eventually chariot racing was added and other sports. And eventually the length of the games increased as well, so we're talking about 5 days of competition. Now, the growth of the games fostered professionalism among the competitors, and the Olympic ideals waned as royalty began to compete for personal gains. So it became not just honoring the gods, but also honoring the human athletes. Now, in 394 AD, so the beginning of the Christian era, the games were officially ended because at the time there was a feeling that they had pagan connotations. Now, fast forward to 1892, and this is the beginning of the modern Olympic Games. A young French nobleman, Pierre de Coubertin, may be regarded as the father of the modern Olympic Games, or the modern Olympic movement. So he believed that it would be very useful in Europe to revive this tradition of that the Greeks had, this wholesome development of mind and body. His first organizational efforts were made in 1892, and at that time the response was very meager. So people were not enthusiastic about reviving this ancient Greek tradition. But he persisted, and on June 16, 1894, an international sports congress eventually convened. Several countries were in attendance, including Belgium, England, France, Greece, Italy, Russia, Spain, Sweden, and the United States. And these countries supported Pierre de Coubertin in reviving the Olympic Games. It was decided that Greece was the appropriate country to host the first modern Olympics, and then it was decided that every 4 years the Games would move to a different city around the world. And the International Olympic Committee was created on June 23, 1894, and I will come back to tell you a little bit more about this governing organ. Now, in 1896, the first modern Olympic Games took place in Athens in Greece. They involved 9 sports: cycling, fencing, gymnastics, lawn tennis, shooting, swimming, track and field, weightlifting, and wrestling. The games were very successful, and the second Olympic Games were held in France. So then the Olympic Games would be held every 4 years, so 900, 904, 908, etc. And the number of competitors more than quadrupled between the first Olympic Games and 1908, for example. So the first Olympic Games saw the participation of 311 athletes, and in 1908 we're talking about 2,082. Now, up to now we are talking about the Summer Olympics. So that includes only summer sports. In 1924 was the first time when winter sports were introduced. And there was the birth of the Winter Olympics. And I guess this was because northern countries with a harsh climate said, well, we want to host the Olympics too, and we want something, we want to participate with the sports that we're familiar with and that we're good at. So it felt that winter sports can benefit the overall event. So first, it was decided to hold a separate cold weather sports site in the same year as the Summer Games. So the initial idea was that the same country would host both the Winter and the Summer Games as part of the same event. But apparently this was too much, so this idea was short-lived. So until 1992, the Winter Games and the Summer Games were held every 4 years on the same year, but not as part of the same event. And then in 1994, the Winter and the Summer Games started alternating every 2 years, with each Games taking place every 4 years. And the number of competitors and the number of sports and events has been growing steadily. So, for example, in 1980, we're talking about 1,600 athletes from 38 nations who competed at the Winter Olympic Games at Lake Placid. And the program included Alpine and Nordic skiing, biathlon, ice hockey, figure skating and speed skating, bobsled and luge. And then fast forward to 2018, the number of athletes, sports, and events in the last Winter Olympics in PyeongChang was 2,952 athletes who competed in 102 events across 15 different sports. Okay, so this is briefly the history and the expansion and the structure of the events. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the organizational side of the festival. So the governing body, as I said, the major governing body is the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC. This is a non-profit, independent international organization and is the supreme authority of the Olympic movement. The headquarters are in Switzerland. The work of the Olympic Committee is governed by the Olympic Charter. This is the document that was first drafted in 1892. Excuse me. In 1898, and it outlines the fundamental principles and values of the Olympic movement, of the rules, the guidelines, the bylaws, and it's in English and French, which are the two official languages of the Olympic movement. Now, the International Olympic Committee controls the work of two other bodies. One of them being the International Sports Federations. Now, an international sports federation manages and promotes and oversees the organization of events and work within a particular sports discipline internationally. For example, FIFA, that we're all familiar with, this is the International Federation of Football, is responsible for promoting football internationally, making sure that everybody has access to it. It addresses integrity and fair pay, organizing and promoting major international tournaments such as the World Cup, and of course, it's also responsible for the events during the Olympic Games. Now, each international sports federation has national federations that are affiliated with them. For example, FIFA currently has 211 members. In other words, 211 national football associations are affiliated with this international federation. Now, in order to be recognized by the IOC, an international sports federation must ensure that its practices and activities are consistent with the Olympic Charter. So this is one organ that's controlled by the Olympic Committee. Another organ is national Olympic committees. So these are national organizations that are responsible for organizing their country's participation in the Olympic Games. So one of the jobs of those committees, for example, is to nominate a city as a host for future Olympic Games. They also promote the development and training of athletes, coaches, and the officials at a national level. Currently, there are 206 National Olympic Committees that are recognized by the IOC. They all are members of the Association of National Olympic Committees. There is, of course, also an organizing committee for each Olympic Games, whose job is to oversee the organization of the specific Olympic Games. The IOC also initiated the creation of the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, which was established on November 10, 1999, and is located in Montreal in Canada. The job of the agency is to promote, coordinate, and monitor the fight against drug use in sports, and in particular, of course, during the Olympic Games, and not just drugs, but particularly performance-enhancing drugs that unfortunately have become quite popular among athletes. Its activities include specific scientific research, education, development of anti-doping capacities and increasing drug testing standards, and monitoring the compliance with the World Anti-Doping Code. Okay, so how much time do I have?
You're at 13 minutes.
13 minutes. Okay, I think I can zip through the rest. Okay, I know interpreters love to hear that. Now, how much does this cost? So maintaining those organizations, organizing those fabulous events, and where does the money come from? Okay, so the cost of the games comprises, among other costs, sports-related costs as well, then security costs, as well as building and or upgrading the necessary infrastructure. So we're talking about event venues, we're talking about sports facilities, but also transportation, hotels, or even nightclubs or other entertainment venues. Now, things like infrastructure, hotels, entertainment venues, etc., they're often it's often assumed that the city that hosts the Olympic will continue to benefit from those in the long run, long after the Olympic Games are over. So this is often considered an investment. But as we will see in a second, that's not necessarily the case. Now, I'll give you some statistics. Sports-related costs alone, on average since 1960s, have been for the Summer Games $5.2 billion, and for the Winter Games $3.1 billion. Now, to host an Olympics, the Olympic Games, is an honor for the city. And it's very prestigious. It's very prestigious for the athlete. And so no expense is spared. And cities often go into debt to finance the Olympic Games, hoping that they will be able to recuperate their costs and that will boost the overall economy. But unfortunately, it's not always the case, and it has not been like that from early on. For example, in 1928, the Olympic Games, the Winter Olympics, were held in St. Moritz in Switzerland, and the total costs of the games were 706,000 of Swiss francs, and it doesn't even matter how much it means in terms of today's dollars, but what's important for our purposes is that the losses sustained by the city were 104,800 Swiss francs. So there were losses. Now, 1976, Montreal Summer Olympics, the total cost was $1.4 billion Canadian dollars, and the losses were $990 million. I think this is the painful spot for Quebecers to this day. So the losses were not fully recovered until 2006. Another example, more recent, 2016, the Brazilian government authorized a loan to Rio, $850 million loan to build the Olympic infrastructure. And they justified it by saying that the games will boost the overall economy. But what happened was that the budget of $2.8 billion was overspent by, just listen to this, 368%. So most of the infrastructure was abandoned right after the Olympic Games, and Brazil's GDP continuously declined throughout the year. So there was no boost. But it's not always that bad. So in 1984, during the Sarajevo Winter Olympics, the total costs were about 110, almost $111 million, but the games made a profit of $10 million. And this was actually the first Olympic Games to make a profit since 1948. Do you want to slow down, or am I nearing the end? Nearing the end. How many minutes? 3 minutes. Okay, so I will skip the costs, and then I will talk about politics behind the Olympics, and I'll manage to do it. I'll try to do it in 3 minutes. Okay, so as you see, there's a very complex organizational machinery. There is a lot of money involved. It's a very prestigious event, both for the host city and for the athletes. And of course, you would imagine that it creates a lot of temptation to start abusing whatever advantages you have, or start and cheat the system. For example, bribing the committee in a bid to host the Olympic Games, or bribing the judges at a specific competition to make sure that your athletes win. Another way to hijack the Olympic Games for your political purposes is to boycott the Olympic Games. That happens often when a country or a number of countries want to protest certain political developments. So, for example, in 1980, the Summer Olympics in Moscow were boycotted by the United States, who protested the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet troops in December of 1979. And finally, the use of performance-enhancing drugs, that's another way to cheat the system on the part of the athletes themselves. The types of drugs banned include stimulants, which can be found in cold or cough medications. Caffeine is banned as well. And then narcotics, anabolic steroids, diuretics are among the substances that are not allowed to be used during the Olympic events. Beta blockers is another type, and yet the use of, or alleged use of, those substances has become, and scandals that are associated with using those substances have become notorious in the Olympic Games. So the most recent development, about a week ago, the Telegraph wrote that Russia might be banned from the Summer Olympics in Tokyo in 2020 as punishment for falsifying the data from the Moscow Anti-Doping Lab. According to the publication, WADA has given RUSADA, which is the Russian anti-doping agency, 3 weeks to explain inconsistencies in the data. So I'll stop here and I'll just say that despite all the controversies, high costs, the risk of debt, etc., or perhaps thanks to all those controversies, the Olympic Games remain the most prestigious sporting festival in the world that continues to draw huge crowds of locals and tourists and generate revenue if you are smart and if you use your resources wisely, and create historical and cultural legacy. Thank you.